The jungle doesn't just swallow men, it digests them slowly. It was 1968, somewhere in the rotting heat of the Central Highlands, and the air was thick enough to chew. I'm Captain William Hartford, and that day I was leading 6 of the finest souls I'd ever known into a green abyss. We were hunting for a lieutenant, one of our own held in a cage somewhere in that damp, suffocating maze. We moved like ghosts, or so we prayed. Every step was a lethal gamble with a bouncing Betty or a punji pit hidden beneath layers of decaying leaves. Beside me, Bones, a scrawny mutt we'd adopted who had a better nose for cordite than any machine, suddenly froze. His ears twitched toward a cluster of ferns. My explosives expert, Miller, signaled a tripwire just inches from my lead boot. We were close. Through the heavy canopy we finally saw them, a patrol of Viet Cong, relaxed but lethal, guarding the perimeter of what looked like a hidden trail. We tightened our grip on our CAR-15s, our hearts hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. But the jungle is a fickle witness. A snapped branch, a shift in the wind, something gave us away. A VC sentry turned, his eyes locking onto mine, his finger diving for the trigger of his AK-47. In that heartbeat, our stealth evaporated. Death was a split second away, and the mission felt like it was ending before it truly began. Then the silence was shattered, not by their fire, but by the sharp, surgical crack of a rifle from the ridge behind us. My sniper had found his mark. The dance had started. The stories of men like those in my unit are more than just accounts of combat. They are the living memory of a generation that faced the unimaginable in the green hell of the Vietnam jungle. These chronicles of sacrifice and brotherhood must not be lost to time. If you believe in preserving the legacy of those who served, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. Your support ensures that the honor and the stories of our veterans remain alive for those who come after us. Join us in our duty to remember. The jungle doesn't just hide the enemy, it breathes with them. By 1400 hours, the heat was a physical weight, pressing against our gear and turning our fatigues into a second sodden skin. Miller, our camouflage specialist, raised a closed fist. We froze instantly. In this green hell, if Miller stops, you hold your breath. He knelt, his face painted in streaks of olive and black, blending so perfectly into the foliage that for a second he seemed to vanish into the shadows of the teak trees. He beckoned me forward, pointing at a patch of ground that looked like nothing more than discarded brush. There, beneath a deceptive layer of rotting leaves and a bamboo latticework, was a concealed trapdoor. It wasn't just a hole. It was the gateway to the Iron Triangle's circulatory system. Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of cicadas. "Captain, these trails aren't just footpaths. They lead straight into the gut of the earth." We all knew what that meant. The Viet Cong tunnels were a nightmare of cramped darkness, punji stakes and tunnel rats who knew every inch of the labyrinth. I looked at my men. Jenkins, our explosives expert, was already checking his flashlight at his .45 1911. He knew the drill. To enter those tunnels was to surrender the sky and the open air for a claustrophobic grave. Survival rates for tunnel sweeps were abysmal. It was a war of knives and shadows. But the lieutenant was down there somewhere and the clock was ticking. The silence of the canopy above felt like a judgment. We were 6 men standing on the lid of a hidden world, knowing that once we dropped down, the odds of seeing the sun again were cut in half. "Check your sidearms," I commanded, my voice low and rasping. "We're going into the dark." The transition from the humid, oppressive heat of the Vietnamese surface to the stagnant, earthy darkness of the tunnels was like stepping into a grave that hadn't been filled yet. As we descended into that narrow crawl space, the silence became our only ally and our worst enemy. The air was thick, tasting of stale sweat, damp clay, and the lingering rot of organic matter. I could hear the rhythmic, shallow breathing of my men behind me. We weren't just soldiers anymore. We were ghosts navigating a subterranean labyrinth designed to swallow men whole. I led the way, my Colt 1911 gripped tight, its weight a small comfort against the crushing weight of the earth above us. We had only crawled about 30 meters when I felt a sharp tap on my boot. It was O'Malley, our explosive specialist, a man who had survived 3 tours by being more meticulous than a watchmaker. I froze instantly. The rest of the team followed suit, a chained reaction of stillness. O'Malley edged forward, his small penlight emitting a sliver of illumination no wider than a needle. There, stretched across the path at shin level, was a thin, nearly invisible monofilament wire. It was anchored to a crude wooden peg on one side and disappeared into a hollowed-out niche on the other. O'Malley leaned in, his face inches from the trap. I could see the beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, threatening to sting his eyes, but he didn't blink. He whispered, barely a breath, "Chicone grenade, Type 67. If I hadn't seen the tension on that wire, we'd all be pink mist in a collapsed hole." He pulled out a pair of delicate wire cutters, his hands steady as a surgeon's, despite the cramped quarters. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. With a dull snip, the tension vanished. He carefully neutralized the firing pin and tucked the grenade into his pouch. "One for the road," he muttered. We shared a grim nod. The trap was a reminder that every inch of this dirt was contested, every shadow a potential executioner. We pushed deeper. The tunnel began to widen slightly, allowing us to move in a low crouch rather than a belly crawl. About 50 yards past the trap, the air changed. It wasn't just the smell of dirt anymore. There was the faint, acrid scent of kerosene and the smell of cooked rice. I raised a hand, signaling a halt. Miller, our camouflage expert, moved to the front. He had an uncanny ability to blend into any environment, even one as monochrome as this. He pointed toward a bend in the tunnel where a flickering orange glow suggested a lantern. I signaled for Jackson, our close-quarters specialist. He was a man of few words and violent actions, carrying a blackened combat knife that had seen more use than his rifle in these tight spaces. We moved like shadows, our boots muffled by the damp floor. As we rounded the corner, we saw them. 3 Viet Cong soldiers huddled around a small table fashioned from an old ammunition crate. One was cleaning a Type 56 carbine, the other 2 were speaking in low, hushed tones over a map. They didn't hear us. They didn't have time to scream. Jackson moved with a terrifying fluid grace. He reached the first man before the soldier could even look up, his hand clamping over the man's mouth while the blade found its mark under the ribs. Simultaneously, Miller and I lunged for the other 2. I didn't use my pistol. The noise would have brought the entire mountain down on us. I used the weight of my frame to pin the second soldier against the dirt wall, my hands finding his throat, squeezing with the desperate strength of a man who knew it was his life or theirs. It was a brutal, intimate way to kill, no distance, no abstractions. I felt the life drain out of him as he clawed at my forearms. By the time I let go, Jackson had already finished with the third. We stood there for a moment in the flickering light of their lantern, breathing hard, the metallic scent of fresh blood now competing with the kerosene. I looked down at the table. Among the bowls of rice and the carbine parts was a hand-drawn map of the local sector, with several red circles marking reinforced bunkers further down the line. One of those circles had a notation in Vietnamese that Miller translated with a grim smile. High-value detention. A surge of adrenaline, a feeling I hadn't felt since we crossed the fence, washed over me. Hope. It was a dangerous emotion in a place like this, but seeing that map, seeing the evidence that we were finally closing in on the lieutenant, galvanized the men. Their eyes, once shadowed by the fatigue of the jungle, now burned with a renewed focus. We weren't just wandering in the dark anymore. We had a trail. We gathered the map, extinguished the lantern to hide our tracks, and melted back into the shadows of the deeper tunnels. The mission was no longer a ghost hunt. It was a race against time in the belly of the beast. That's the only way I can describe it. The damp, heavy air moved in rhythmic pulses, carrying the stench of wrought, stale smoke and something far worse, the copper tongue of fresh blood. We were deep in the guts of the earth, our world reduced to the flickering beam of a shielded flashlight and the sound of our own labored breathing. Then the sound hit us. It wasn't a mechanical noise or the rustle of the wind. It was a scream, high, jagged, and ending in a wet, choking gasp. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten he had a name, a man being dismantled piece by piece. My hand tightened on the grip of my Colt 1911. Behind me, I could feel the tension radiating off Kowalski and Miller. We didn't need to speak. We knew that voice. It was Lieutenant Vance. We crawled toward the source of the sound, our bellies scraping against the jagged clay. Every inch felt like a mile. The interrogation was happening just ahead. The Vietnamese voices, sharp and demanding, punctuated by the dull thud of blows. We reached a vertical shaft, a crude wooden ladder leading upward toward a sliver of gray, filtered light. I signaled for silence, my fingers pressed to my lips. I climbed first, moving with the agonizing slowness of a predator that knows one wrong vibration will end everything. As my head cleared the top of the ladder, I didn't find a room. I found an opening concealed beneath the floorboards of a large, thatch-roof hut, the heart of the Viet Cong encampment. I peered through the cracks in the bamboo flooring. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The lieutenant was there, tied to a heavy wooden chair in the center of the hut. His face was a mask of purple bruises and torn skin, his uniform reduced to rags. 2 NVA officers stood over him, one holding a blood-stained bamboo cane, the other smoking a cigarette with a chilling nonchalance. But it was what lay beyond the hut that turned my blood to ice. Through the open doorway, I could see the rest of the base. It wasn't just a camp. It was a fortified staging area. At least 20 soldiers were visible, moving with purpose. Some were cleaning their Type 56 rifles, others were huddled around a cooking fire, and 2 were manning a heavy machine gun nest aimed directly at the jungle perimeter. We were 6 men in a hole, and there were more than 20 of them in the killing zone above us. I lowered myself back down the ladder, my face grim. Miller leaned in, his eyes searching mine in the gloom. "How bad, Cap?" he whispered. I didn't sugarcoat it. Vance is alive, but barely. They're working him over in a hut right above us. But the yard is crawling with them. At least 20, maybe more, with a mounted MG. If we trip the wire now, we're dead before we hit the grass. I saw Jackson, our sniper, adjust his cap. He was a man of few words, but his steady gaze was the only thing keeping the panic at bay in that cramped space. "We can't leave him, sir," Jackson said softly. "Not like that." I nodded. The code wasn't just words on a manual. It was the only thing we had left in this godforsaken jungle. We huddled in the darkness, the screams from above continuing to tear through the silence. It's a specific kind of torture. hearing your own kind suffer while you stand paralyzed by the marth of war. 6 against 24 is a suicide mission. But we weren't just any 6 men. I looked at O'Malley. He was already checking his satchel charges, his fingers dancing over the blasting caps with a surgeon's precision. He knew what I was thinking. If we couldn't win a fair fight, we'd have to make the world burn around them. The plan began to take shape in the mud. O'Malley would slip out through a secondary crawl space. Miller had spotted to plant surprises under the ammo cache and the MG nest. Jackson would find a vantage point in the tree line if he could slip out the back. Kowalski and I would be the hammer, breaching the floorboards to take the hut. "Listen up," I whispered, my voice a low rasp that carried the weight of a death warrant. "We don't have the luxury of a clean extract. When O'Malley's charges go off, that's our clock. We have exactly 90 seconds to secure the lieutenant and get to the rally point. If you get separated, you head north. Do not stop for anything." The men nodded, their faces hardened into stone masks. The fear was there, I could see it in the way. Miller's hand shook slightly as he checked his grease gun, but it was suppressed by a grim professional necessity. We were about to kick a hornet's nest while standing in the middle of it. I looked up at the ceiling, the dust falling into my eyes as the guards moved above us. The smell of their tobacco drifted down, a mundane scent in a moment of extreme violence. I thought about the families of these men, and I thought about Vance's mother back in Ohio. The war didn't care about any of them. It only cared about the next minute, the next magazine, the next breath. I placed my hand on the ladder. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a low, ominous moaning. They were finished asking questions. Now they were just finishing him. On my mark, I breathed. The silence in the tunnel was absolute. The calm before the storm that would either save a soul or bury us all in the red clay of the Central Highlands. The air in the Central Highlands during the monsoon season doesn't just sit on you, it suffocates you. It's a thick, wet wool blanket that smells of wrought, cordite, and the metallic tongue of old blood. We were positioned in the shadows, barely 20 yards from the perimeter of the VC encampment, watching the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp inside the primary hut. We had been so close. O'Malley, a man who could wire a detonator in a hurricane without breaking a sweat, had moved like a ghost to plant the charges, but the jungle has a way of betraying even the best of us. A stray twig, a shift in the wind, or perhaps just the cruel hand of fate. A night patrol, returning earlier than our intelligence suggested, stumbled right onto him. The sound of the struggle was brief, the sickening thud of a rifle but against bone, a muffled groan, and then the predatory shouts of the Viet Cong. From our position in the elephant grass, my heart didn't just race, it turned into a sledgehammer against my ribs. Seeing O'Malley dragged into that same hut where Lieutenant Vance was being held felt like a bayonet twist in the gut. Through my binoculars, I saw them throw him down. Within minutes, the screams started. It wasn't the cinematic scream you hear in movies. It was a raw, primal sound of a man being broken. A sound that strips away your humanity and replaces it with a cold, jagged edge of desperation. O'Malley was one of mine. He was the kid who joked about opening a bar in Boston after the war. Hearing him cry out as they applied the same interrogation techniques to him that they had been using on Vance was more than I could bear. My men looked at me, their faces illuminated by the dim moonlight, their eyes wide with a silent, frantic question. "Captain, what do we do?" "Change of plans," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "We don't have the luxury of a timed fuse anymore. Jackson, you see that heavy machine gun nest on the eastern flank? Take the gunner out the moment the first charge goes. Miller, Kowalski, you're with me. We're going through the front door. We don't stop for anything until we reach that hut. If it moves and it's wearing black pajamas, you put it down. The tactical reality was grim. We were 6 men against 20 plus, and now they were alerted. But in the bush, momentum is often the only thing that keeps you alive when the odds are stacked against you. I felt the weight of the M16 in my hands, the cold steel a stark contrast to the sweltering heat. I checked my magazine one last time, the click of the plastic follower sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. On my mark, I breathed into the radio. I watched through the brush as a VC officer stepped out of the hut, wiping blood from his hands onto a rag. The fury that boiled up inside me was quiet, focused. I pressed the remote detonator. The world didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The C4 O'Malley had planted near the fuel drums, and the secondary barracks went up in a magnificent, terrifying bloom of orange and black fire. The shock wave rolled over us, knocking the breath from my lungs and sending a shower of dirt and bamboo splinters into the air. Before the echoes of the blast could even fade, Jackson's Winchester .70 barked from the tree line. The gunner at the heavy MG spun away, his chest opened up by the precision shot. "Go, go, go!" I roared, leaping from the brush. We moved in a staggered line, a symphony of violence in the mud. Kowalski led the way, his shotgun barking rhythmically *boom clack. Boom clack * clearing the initial wave of dazed guards who were still trying to understand why their world was on fire. The smell of burning diesel and singed hair filled my nostrils. I fired in short, controlled bursts, my sights tracking targets through the haze of smoke and chaos. We were a machine of necessity. Miller was a blur to my left, his suppressed submachine gun spitting lead with surgical efficiency. We reached the perimeter of the central hut just as a group of VCs scrambled to form a defensive line. It was a close-quarters nightmare. I remember the face of the boy I shot at the threshold. He couldn't have been more than 16. His eyes wide with terror, but there was no room for pity, only the cold mathematics of survival. We breached the hut with a fragmentation grenade. The blast was contained, a dull hump that sent dust pouring from the thatched roof. I was the first one through the door, my boots slipping on the slick, blood-stained floorboards. The scene inside was a vision of hell. Vance was slumped in the corner, barely conscious, his face a map of bruises. Next to him, O'Malley was pinned to a wooden chair, his shirt torn away, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. 2 VC were reaching for their sidearms. Miller and I dropped them before they could clear leather. I knelt beside O'Malley, cutting his bonds with a combat knife. His eyes were unfocused, his fingers mangled. But when he saw me, he managed a weak, bloody grin. "Took you ... long enough, Cap," he wheezed. I didn't have time to answer. Outside, the shouting was getting louder. The enemy was recovering from the initial shock, and they were closing in. The mission had shifted from a surgical extraction to a desperate breakout, and the jungle was waiting to swallow us all. The air inside the compound was a thick, suffocating slurry of cordite, pulverized earth, and the metallic tong of blood. The blast O'Malley had set. Our desperate signal for the end of the world had done its job. But it hadn't bought us an eternity. It had only bought us a few seconds of confusion. I grabbed Lieutenant Vance by his bloodied web gear, hoisting him up. He was a ghost of a man, his eyes unfocused, his body trembling from the systematic cruelty he'd endured. O'Malley wasn't much better. His hands were a mess of raw nerves and broken bone, but he was standing, leaning heavily on Miller. "Move! Out the back!" I roared over the rhythmic thumping of my own heart. "We didn't run." "You don't run in a firefight like that. You move with purpose, your eyes scanning the periphery, your weapon lead heavy in your hands." We exited the remains of the command hut, just as the first VC counterattack began to organize. The jungle, which had been our silent enemy all week, was now our only sanctuary. But it felt miles away across a killing field of churned mud and burning bamboo. "Covering fire," Kowalski yelled, his CAR-15 spitting lead in short, controlled bursts toward a cluster of bunkers to our north. The muzzle flashes were blinding in the dim, smoky light. We were a wounded animal, trying to crawl back into the brush. I had Vance's arm over my shoulder, my boots slipping in the gore-slicked clay. Every step was an agony of effort. Behind us, the heavy machine gun we thought we'd silenced began to cough again. The gunner was dead, but another had taken his place. The thud-thud-thud of the .50 caliber rounds tearing through the wooden crates near us was a sound. I'll never forget, it was the sound of the Reaper closing the gap. That's when it happened. A stray burst caught Kowalski. I didn't see it, but I felt the shift in the air. There was a sickening thwack, the unmistakable sound of chivalosity lead meeting human bone and muscle. Kowalski went down with a strang-led cry, his leg buckling beneath him as a round shattered his femur. The momentum of our retreat stuttered. In that moment, the math of survival changed. We had 2 men who could barely walk, and now 1 who couldn't move at all. "Man down! Kowalski's hit!" Miller screamed, dropping his hold on O'Malley to dive toward our fallen brother. The VC realized we were crippled. They started to emerge from the tree line, not as shadows, but as a wave. I dropped Vance into the mud, shouting for him to stay low, and shouldered my rifle. I fired until the bolt locked back, the heat from the barrel radiating against my face. I swapped mags with fingers that felt like wooden blocks. "Miller, get him up! We don't leave him!" Kowalski was pale, his face a mask of shock, clutching his thigh where the blood was pulsing out in bright rhythmic spurts. "Leave me, Cap," he wheezed, his voice thin. "Just get the lieutenant out. I'll hold him." "Shut up, Kowalski," I snapped, though my gut was twisting. I looked at my men. We were exhausted, bleeding, and surrounded in a valley that didn't even have a name on most maps. The rain started to fall then, a sudden tropical deluge that turned the smoke into a grey shroud. It was a mercy and a curse. It hit us, but it made the ground a slide of liquid filth. We formed a desperate perimeter. I took Kowalski's other side, and together with Miller, we dragged him toward the tree line, the dirt kicking up around our feet from incoming fire. Every inch felt like a mile. I could hear the VC shouting to each other, closing the pints. We were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. My sniper, positioned somewhere in the tree line, was the only thing keeping them from overrunning us. Every few seconds, a sharp crack from his rifle would drop a charging guerrilla, but he was 1 man against a company. We finally hit the edge of the dense foliage, the shadows of the teak trees swallowing us, but the safety was an illusion. The extraction zone was still 500 meters through uphill terrain, and the enemy was right on our heels, guided by the trail of blood Kowalski was leaving behind. I looked at O'Malley. The man was barely conscious, but he had a grenade in his good hand, the pin already straightened. He looked at me with a grim nod. We weren't just fighting for a mission anymore. We were fighting for the right to die on our own terms. The will to survive is often described as a spark, but in that jungle under that fire, it felt more like a heavy, cold weight, a debt we owed to the men standing next to us.